3 children sat silently at the kitchen table, pretending they weren't hungry. Their mother stared at a stack of unpaid bills and a notice that could take away the only home they had left. She had exhausted every option, and time was running out. But what happened next would change all 4 of their lives forever. Because on the very day she was about to lose everything, a cowboy she had never met walked into her life and made a decision that nobody in town saw coming. Stay with me, because this true-to-life story begins on the worst day of a struggling mother's life. The rain tapped softly against the kitchen window as Sarah Mitchell sat alone at the small wooden table in her modest home. The clock on the wall read nearly midnight, but sleep felt impossible. Spread out before her were stacks of bills, overdue notices, and a worn notebook filled with calculations she had checked over and over again. No matter how many times she added the numbers, the result never changed. She owed more money than she could possibly pay. In the next room, her 3 children slept peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering around their family. 11-year-old Ethan shared a room with his younger brother, Noah, while 7-year-old Emma slept beneath a blanket decorated with faded stars. Watching them sleep had become Sarah's favorite part of the day. It was the only time she didn't have to hide her fear behind a brave smile. Just 2 years earlier, life had been different. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been stable. Then a series of setbacks arrived, one after another. Medical bills, unexpected repairs, and the loss of steady work had drained every bit of savings she had. Since then, she had worked every job she could find. She cleaned offices before sunrise, stocked shelves in the evenings, and accepted any extra shifts offered to her. Still, the bills kept growing faster than she could earn. Sarah picked up a bright red envelope from the table. She had already read it 3 times that day. The words felt heavier each time she looked at them. It was a final notice. Unless she paid a large portion of the debt within days, her family could lose the home they had lived in for nearly 8 years. A knot tightened in her stomach. She glanced around the kitchen. The old refrigerator hummed quietly. The paint on the walls was beginning to peel. The furniture didn't match. Yet every corner of the house held memories. Birthday celebrations, holiday dinners, school projects taped proudly to the walls. This wasn't just a house. It was the only place her children truly felt safe. A sudden creak echoed from the hallway. Sarah quickly wiped tears from her face as Ethan appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Mom?" he asked softly. "Why are you still awake?" She forced a smile. "Just taking care of a few things, sweetheart." Ethan looked at the papers covering the table. Even in the dim light, she could see concern in his young face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan asked a question that made her heart sink. "Mom, are we going to lose our home?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she couldn't find the words to answer. Ethan stood quietly in the doorway, waiting. He was only 11 years old, yet lately he seemed far older. Children noticed more than adults realized, and despite Sarah's efforts to shield her kids from worry, Ethan had clearly seen enough to understand that something was wrong. She forced herself to smile. "We're going to be okay," she said gently. But even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure she believed them. Ethan looked down at the papers spread across the table. "You've been saying that for months." The honesty in his voice stung. Sarah pulled out a chair and motioned for him to sit beside her. He climbed into the seat and stared at the stack of bills. There was no point pretending anymore, not completely. "We've had a hard time lately," she admitted. "But I'm doing everything I can." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know." Those 2 simple words nearly brought her to tears. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn and headed to her first job. She spent hours cleaning office buildings while most people were still asleep. By afternoon, she was helping stock shelves at a local grocery store. Her feet ached constantly, and exhaustion followed her everywhere, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Every dollar mattered. Even with 2 jobs, however, the numbers refused to work. When she returned home that evening, She began searching the house for things she could sell. An old television, a coffee table, a jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother. One by one, valuable items disappeared from the home. The children noticed. "Where's Grandma's necklace?" Emma asked one evening. Sarah hesitated. "I loaned it to someone for a while," she replied softly. Emma accepted the answer, but Sarah felt guilty. The necklace had been one of the last meaningful possessions she owned. Over the following days, more things were sold, yet each payment barely made a dent in the growing debt. One afternoon, Sarah sat in her car outside the bank and stared at her account balance. After paying utilities, groceries, and other essentials, she had almost nothing left. Her hands trembled as she looked at the latest figures. She was still thousands of dollars short. Thousands. The amount felt impossible. As she drove home, dark clouds gathered overhead. The weather seemed to mirror her thoughts. Every solution she had imagined had failed. Friends were struggling with their own problems. Family members lived too far away and couldn't help financially. For the first time, Sarah began wondering what would happen if she truly lost the house. Where would the children sleep? How would they stay in the same school? How would she explain that everything they knew was gone? That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Sarah opened the mailbox one final time. Inside was another letter. As she read the contents, the color drained from her face. The deadline had been moved up. She now had even less time than she thought. Sarah stood frozen on the front porch, staring at the letter in her trembling hands. She read it once, then twice, then a third time, hoping the words would somehow change. They didn't. The lender had officially moved up the deadline. Instead of having several more days to gather the money, she now had less than 48 hours. If the required payment wasn't received by then, the process of taking the house would begin. A cold wave of fear swept through her. For months, she had been fighting to stay ahead of disaster. Every extra shift, every sleepless night, every possession she had sold had been part of that fight. Now it felt as though all of it had accomplished nothing. Slowly, Sarah folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket before walking inside. The children were gathered around the kitchen table, finishing homework. Noah was struggling with a math assignment while Emma colored pictures beside him. Ethan looked up as soon as she entered the room. "Everything okay, Mum?" he asked. Sarah forced a smile. "Of course." But Ethan's expression showed he wasn't convinced. She moved around the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner, doing her best to act normal. The children talked about school, friends, and upcoming activities, but Sarah could barely focus on their words. Her mind remained trapped inside the letter sitting in her pocket. The deadline, 48 hours, the amount she still owed. The fear became so overwhelming that she felt physically sick. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in the living room. The house was silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. She pulled out the letter again. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Not the quiet tears she usually hid. These were different. The kind that came when someone had reached the end of their strength. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Every fear she had been carrying poured out at once. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for Ethan, Noah, and Emma. They had already endured so much. The thought of telling them they might lose their home felt unbearable. After several minutes, she finally wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she heard a floorboard creak behind her. Sarah looked up. Ethan stood at the end of the hallway. His face was pale. He had seen everything. Without saying a word, he walked into the room and sat beside her. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan quietly reached for her hand. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered. The words broke her heart. A child shouldn't have to comfort his parent. Sarah squeezed his hand and fought back another wave of tears. The next morning, she dropped the kids off at school before heading into town to search for any possible solution. She made phone calls, sent messages, asked questions she never thought she would have to ask. Every answer was the same. No, No one could help. By late afternoon, exhausted and defeated, she stopped at a grocery store to buy a few essentials. As she walked back toward her car, carrying a small bag of groceries, she lowered her head and tried to hold back tears. She didn't notice the man watching from across the parking lot, but someone had noticed her struggle, and before the day was over, their lives were about to cross in a way neither of them could have imagined. Sarah hurried across the grocery store parking lot, keeping her eyes fixed on the ground. She hoped no one would notice the tears she was struggling to hide. The small bag hanging from her arm contained only the absolute necessities: bread, milk, eggs, and a few canned goods. Even those items had stretched her budget to its limit. As she reached her aging car, she fumbled for her keys. One of the grocery bags slipped from her hand. Before she could react, the bag hit the pavement and burst open. A carton of eggs cracked instantly, and several cans rolled across the parking lot. Sarah closed her eyes. It felt like the final insult after weeks of bad news. "Easy there." A calm voice broke the silence. She looked up and saw a tall man walking toward her. He wore worn cowboy boots, faded blue jeans, and a weathered brown hat. His face showed signs of years spent working outdoors, but there was kindness in his eyes. Without hesitation, he bent down and began gathering the scattered groceries. "You don't have to do that," Sarah said quickly, embarrassed. "It's no trouble," the man replied. Within moments, he had collected the rolling cans and placed them back into the bag. "Looks like the eggs didn't survive," he said with a small smile. Sarah managed a weak laugh. "No, I guess they didn't." The cowboy handed her the bag. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he noticed her eyes. She had clearly been crying. Most people would have looked away and minded their own business. He didn't. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked gently. Sarah immediately nodded. "I'm fine." The answer came too quickly. The cowboy tilted his head slightly. "No offense," he said, "but you don't look fine." Sarah looked away. She didn't know this man. She had no reason to tell him anything. Yet after months of carrying the weight alone, pretending everything was okay had become exhausting. "It's just been a hard few months," she admitted. The cowboy listened quietly. No interruptions, no judgment, just patience. Something about that made it easier to keep talking. Before she realized it, she found herself explaining more than she intended. Not every detail, but enough. She told him she was raising 3 children on her own. She mentioned working multiple jobs. She spoke about the bills, the debt, and the fear of losing her home. The cowboy's expression grew serious. 3 kids, he asked. Sarah nodded. Ethan, Noah, and Emma. The man glanced toward her car, where children's backpacks were visible in the back seat. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he quietly asked, "How much time do you have left?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Less than 2 days." The words sounded even worse when spoken aloud. The cowboy looked toward the horizon as if considering something. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "My name's Jack Callahan," he said. Sarah accepted the card. "If you need anything, give me a call." She looked at him, confused. "You don't even know me." Jack shrugged. "Maybe not, but I know what hard times look like." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long while. Hope. Only a tiny spark of it. But it was there. As Jack turned and walked back toward his truck, Sarah glanced down at the card in her hand. What she didn't know was that their conversation had affected him far more than he had let on. Because that evening, after returning home, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the struggling mother and her 3 children. And before the night was over, he was about to make a decision that would change everything. That evening, Jack Callahan sat alone on the front porch of his ranch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold, but he barely noticed. His thoughts kept returning to the woman he had met in the grocery store parking lot. Sarah's exhausted eyes, the worry in her voice, the mention of 3 children depending entirely on her. Most of all, he couldn't forget the hopelessness she had tried so hard to hide. Jack had seen difficult times before, Life on a ranch taught a person that setbacks could come without warning. Droughts, injuries, failed harvests, and financial struggles were all part of life. Years earlier, he had faced hardships of his own and knew what it felt like to wonder how things would ever get better. That was why Sarah's situation bothered him so much. He knew she wasn't looking for sympathy. She was simply trying to survive. After a long silence, Jack stood up, grabbed his truck keys, and headed back into town. The next morning, Sarah was awakened by a knock at her front door. Confused, she glanced at the clock. It was barely 7 o'clock. When she opened the door, nobody was there. At least, not at first. Then she noticed several grocery bags sitting neatly on the porch. Fresh bread, milk, fruit, vegetables, cereal. Enough food to help feed her family for days. Sarah looked around the neighborhood, but whoever had left the groceries was already gone. Inside one of the bags was a small handwritten note. "Just a little help, keep going." No signature, no name. Sarah immediately suspected who had sent it. Later that afternoon, she called the number on Jack's card. When he answered, she thanked him. Jack laughed softly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jack. "Okay, maybe I know a little." For the first time in weeks, Sarah found herself smiling. Over the next few days, other small acts of kindness began appearing. A neighbor unexpectedly dropped off homemade meals. Someone paid for the children's school supplies. A local mechanic repaired a problem with Sarah's car and refused payment. The support meant more than she could express. For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. Yet despite the kindness, the biggest problem remained: the debt. Every generous gesture helped her family survive, but none of it came close to solving the amount she still owed. Late one evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table reviewing the numbers again. The reality was impossible to ignore. Even after all the help she had received, she was still far short of the money needed to save her home. The deadline was approaching fast. Meanwhile, across town, Jack stared at the same figures he had written down after speaking with Sarah. The amount was staggering. For several minutes, he sat silently. Then he picked up his phone. If one person couldn't solve this problem alone, maybe an entire community could. And the first call he made that night would set something extraordinary into motion. Jack set his phone down for only a moment before picking it up again. Then he made another call, and another, and another. By the end of the night, he had spoken to ranchers, business owners, church members, teachers, and old friends from across the county. He told them about a hard-working mother who was doing everything she could to keep a roof over her children's heads. He told them about the 3 kids who might lose the only home they had ever known. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't beg. He simply told the truth. And the truth was powerful enough. The next morning, people began responding. Some offered money. Others offered food, clothing, or services. A local restaurant owner promised meals for the family whenever they needed them. A hardware store owner donated supplies to help with repairs around the house. Several ranchers contributed what they could, even though many of them weren't wealthy themselves. Word spread quickly. Within hours, people who had never met Sarah were talking about her situation. Many recognized the struggle. They had faced hard times of their own at some point in life. They understood how quickly circumstances could change. What surprised Jack most was how eager people were to help. The community wasn't responding because of publicity or attention. They were responding because they genuinely cared. Meanwhile, Sarah had no idea what was happening. She spent her days working and worrying, convinced that time was running out. Then her phone began ringing. The first call came from a local teacher. She wanted to know if the children needed anything for school. The second came from a church volunteer offering assistance. The third was from a woman Sarah had never met, who wanted to contribute toward the family's expenses. By the end of the day, Sarah was overwhelmed. Not by fear, by kindness. For months she had felt invisible. Now complete strangers were showing compassion she never expected. That evening, Ethan noticed the difference immediately. "You smiled today," he said during dinner. Sarah looked up. What? You smiled, Ethan repeated. A lot. For a moment, Sarah laughed. Maybe he was right. The burden wasn't gone, but for the first time in a very long while, it didn't feel quite as heavy. Over the next 2 days, donations continued arriving. Small amounts, large amounts, everything in between. Each contribution moved them a little closer to safety. Jack kept careful track of every dollar raised. Late one afternoon, he sat at his kitchen table reviewing the total. A slow smile appeared on his face. The community had done something remarkable. Together, they had raised more money than he ever imagined possible. But as he compared the total against the amount Sarah owed, his smile faded. They were still short, not by a few dollars, not by a few hundred, by several thousand. Jack leaned back in his chair and stared at the numbers. The deadline was now less than 24 hours away. The town had already given generously. Asking for more didn't seem fair. Yet if the remaining amount wasn't paid by the next day, Sarah and her children could still lose everything. Across town, Sarah sat on her porch, watching the sunset, unaware of how close they had come, or how close they still were to losing it all. And as darkness settled over the county, Jack realized there was only one way the remaining debt could be paid. The solution would require a sacrifice he never expected to make himself. Jack barely slept that night. The numbers remained stuck in his mind. No matter how many times he reviewed them, the answer was the same. The community had done something incredible, raising enough money to give Sarah and her children a real chance. But a large gap still remained, and the deadline was only hours away. As dawn broke over the ranch, Jack stepped outside and looked across the fields he had spent years building. Every fence post, every shed, every piece of equipment represented hard work and sacrifice. He knew exactly what he had to do. The question was whether he was willing to do it. For several minutes, he stood in silence. Then he made his decision. By mid-morning, Jack was meeting with a longtime friend who owned a livestock operation nearby. Together they walked through one of the ranch's pastures. "You sure about this?" his friend asked. Jack nodded. "Yeah. It'll set you back." "I know." His friend looked at him carefully. Most people wouldn't do this for someone they barely know. Jack stared across the open land. Maybe, but those kids didn't ask for any of this. A few hours later, the deal was done. Jack had sold something valuable, something he had planned to keep for years. The money wasn't easy to give up. But the moment the payment cleared, he transferred every dollar needed to close the gap. The remaining debt was covered. For the first time in months, Sarah's family was safe. Yet she had no idea. That afternoon, Sarah sat at her kitchen table staring at the clock. Every minute felt heavier than the last. Her stomach churned with anxiety as she waited for news she feared would change her life forever. Then her phone rang. Her hands shook as she answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end introduced itself and explained that the required payment had been received in full. Sarah frowned. "I'm sorry." "What?" "The debt has been paid." For several seconds she couldn't speak. Surely she had misunderstood. "The debt has been paid," the voice repeated. "Your account is current." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "How?" she whispered. The representative couldn't provide many details, only that the payment had been made that day. When the call ended, Sarah remained frozen in her chair. Then the reality finally hit. They weren't losing the house. The nightmare was over. A sob escaped her lips. This time, they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. Hearing the sound, Ethan, Noah, and Emma rushed into the room. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emma asked. Sarah dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around all three children. Nothing else mattered in that moment. "We get to stay," she said through tears. The children stared at her. "What do you mean?" Noah asked. "We get to stay home." The room exploded with emotion. Tears, laughter, hugs. Months of fear disappeared in a matter of seconds. Later that evening, after learning who had made the final sacrifice, Sarah sat in stunned silence. She couldn't believe what Jack had done. The community had helped, but Jack had given up something deeply important to save a family he barely knew. And what happened when Sarah finally faced him the next day would leave everyone who witnessed it struggling to hold back tears. The next morning, Sarah drove to the ranch with her 3 children sitting quietly in the back seat. None of them spoke much during the drive. Sarah was still trying to process everything she had learned the night before. She had finally discovered who paid the remaining debt. Jack Callahan, the cowboy who had first noticed her struggling in a grocery store parking lot. The man who could have walked away like everyone else. The man who didn't. As Sarah's car pulled into the ranch driveway, she saw Jack repairing a section of fence near the barn. He looked up as they approached and immediately knew why they were there. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Sarah stepped forward. Tears filled her eyes. "You saved us," she said quietly. Jack shook his head. "No, a whole town helped. But you paid the rest." Jack looked down at the ground. He had never been comfortable with praise. "I just did what I thought was right." Sarah's voice trembled. "You gave up something valuable for people you barely knew." Jack smiled softly. "Maybe, but every child deserves a safe place to come home to." The words hit Sarah harder than anything else. Without another word, she wrapped her arms around him. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Nearby, Ethan, Noah, and Emma watched silently. They would remember that moment for the rest of their lives. Not because of money, not because of debt, but because they had witnessed what true kindness looked like. Over the following months, life slowly improved. Sarah continued working hard, but now she had breathing room. The constant fear that had followed her family for so long was finally gone. The children focused on school, friendships, and the simple joys of being kids again. The community that had rallied around them never disappeared either. People checked in regularly. Neighbors became friends. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt hopeful about the future. As for Jack, he returned to his normal life. He never asked for recognition, never sought attention, and whenever someone called him a hero, he always gave the same answer. "I just helped when help was needed." But the truth was far greater than that, because one act of kindness had saved more than a house. It had restored hope. It had protected a family, and it had reminded an entire town that even in the hardest moments, compassion still has the power to change lives. Years later, whenever Sarah's children were asked about the most important lesson they learned growing up, they didn't talk about debt or hardship. They talked about a cowboy who saw someone struggling, a cowboy who chose to care, and a cowboy whose kindness changed their lives forever. If this story touched your heart, remember this. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can become the turning point in someone else's life. You may never fully know the battles people are fighting, but a helping hand, a kind word, or a simple decision to care can make all the difference. And if you believe the world needs more stories about compassion, courage, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that good people still exist. Because somewhere out there, another person is facing their darkest day, and your kindness might be the reason they find hope again. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.